The CDC comes out against Hygiene theater. Republicans slam companies that have come out against the Georgia voting law. And Baylor puts Gonzaga's dreams of an undefeated season to bed. Tuesday Need to Know. Let's go. Good morning. This is Cheddar's Need to Know podcast for Tuesday, April 6th. I am Jill Wagner with Carlo Versano. Good morning, Carlo.
Hey, Jill. How are you? How is everybody out there?
Looking around. How's everyone? Oh, wait, it's just me.
Just little old you.
We're okay.
All right, good. I hope everyone's hanging in. I hope everybody's hanging in.
This weather helps. It's been
It's
great.
starting to get a little nice, finally. Yes. Spring is here. Spring is coming. The leaves are blooming. I'm still feeling optimistic. Don't worry.
All right, let's get to the news. The CDC now says that the risk of getting COVID from contaminated surfaces is, quote, generally less than 1 in 10,000. It's an acknowledgement that what's become known as hygiene theater, schools and businesses closing for deep cleanings, for instance, is probably unnecessary. It's something, Carlo, that you and I have been talking about for months now. When this broke yesterday, I was like, Carlo, I thought of you right away. But we're finally seeing the CDC come around. Meanwhile, Walgreens is going to be changing the spacing between Fizer doses after there were complaints that Walgreens was scheduling them 4 weeks apart instead of the recommended 3. The pharmacy chain said it did it to make it easier to schedule appointments. There's no reason to believe, though, that extra week between shots decreases its effectiveness. And the next big state to open vaccine eligibility is New Jersey, where all adults can get vaccinated on April 19th.
Yeah, I thought of you when we're becoming, I think, the same. We have like a mind meld, Jill, after doing this podcast for so long. We think of the same things. It's kind of funny. But I saw that CDC thing come out yesterday, and I was like, why isn't this a bigger deal? Finally, can we please now do away with the deep cleanings? I actually didn't realize this, but did you know some schools out there are closing a day a week so that they can clean like the surfaces and like mop the floors? It's ridiculous that we're still doing this. Like, there's really no excuses now. The CDC knows what's up. The focus has to be on ventilation. That's what we know. The thing is being spread by these aerosols. It's all about indoors. It's all about ventilation indoors. Meanwhile, Jill, 222 deaths yesterday nationally. That's the lowest level since March of 2020. Obviously, Mondays are a little bit tricky with the data because of the weekends. But still, even if we're in this fourth wave, it's just not going to look like past surges. So I don't want people to feel like when they keep hearing like, oh, the cases are surging. That's not good that they are, but the deaths are not following, at least not yet. And that's good news. And there's also good news, more data on the efficacy of these mRNA vaccines. Fizer put out a 6-month update yesterday on the just real world vaccinated people who had their shot 6 months ago. 0 hospitalizations, 0 among the vaccinated, 32 among the placebo group. They also put out real life data from South Africa where that one variant is going strong. 0 COVID cases among the vaccinated versus 9 in the placebo. These vaccines, they are a godsend.
I love the optimism. I'm, of course, going to be the wah-wah, the Debbie Downer voice. One thing that I just wanted to mention that really struck me is what we're hearing about these new variants with kids. Because while it is good news with the vaccines and we're seeing this surge primarily affect younger people who aren't yet vaccinated, schools are really being impacted. And for whatever reason, this new variant, some of these new variants that we're seeing are more prevalent in children. And it's just something to keep an eye on. Some experts are now even saying perhaps they're rethinking the idea of getting back to in-person learning, just because previously we weren't seeing this virus really have a toll on children. And I could tell you anecdotally, one of the local schools where I live, they just got an email just went out to the parents, multiple cases in the high school. I think they said about 7 cases at least. The most through this entire pandemic that they've ever had, I think, is 2, according to one of my friends whose kid is in the school. And she said this is the first time they've ever received an email like that was yesterday. So clearly This is now becoming a young person's surge, and I think we just need to be careful about it.
Sure.
Okay, meanwhile, we do have a new shortage on our hands. The global supply chain problems that we've been talking about are now making their way to America's favorite condiment. A shortage of ketchup packets has hit the restaurant industry after a year of filling to-go orders. Kraft Heinz, which owns 70% of the U.S. ketchup market, was actually caught off guard by the pandemic and couldn't keep up with the surge in orders for those individual packets, leading some restaurant managers to hunt the aisles of Costco for substitutes or just fill their own to-go containers.
This is just a great time to expand your condiment arsenal, I'd say. Anything that is good with ketchup is better with mustard, which is among my hottest of takes, I think. No?
Anything? I don't know about
yeah.
that. French fries?
Yeah, French fries are better with mustard than ketchup. Boom.
I think it could be a time to, if you don't want to expand your condiment choice, you could expand your brand. I do Sir Kensington, actually.
Oh, I have some Sir Kensington mayonnaise, and it's quite good, actually. Mayonnaise, another thing, also just as good. Anything with ketchup, also good with mayonnaise.
Mayonnaise is also much worse for you. Ketchup is high in sugar, but like mayonnaise is very, very fatty. Okay, let's talk a little politics.
Little detour there.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell accusing American companies that have publicly opposed Georgia's new voting law of using, quote, economic blackmail to spread disinformation, and warned of serious consequences for corporations that, quote, behave like a woke parallel government. United Airlines, by the way, the latest big company to come out against the law, which creates new voter ID requirements and puts more control over elections into the hands of state legislatures, while also expanding early voting in rural counties. Similar laws are winding their way through Republican-controlled state houses in Florida, Arizona, and Texas. And this just breaking, ESPN reporting that the MLB All-Star Game is going to be played at Coors Field in Colorado after the league pulled it out of Atlanta because of the Georgia law.
Yeah, that happened last Friday. We didn't get a chance to talk about it, but that was a big deal coming from baseball. So there was a lot going around yesterday about when United came out. It's sort of irrelevant, right? Because United is based in Chicago. It's not like they don't really have a big stake in Georgia the way that like Delta does, just because they're hubbed in Atlanta. But a lot of people were saying like, oh, this is such BS coming from like the airlines because you need an ID to board a flight. Okay, but boarding a flight is not a constitutionally protected right like voting is. So I just those arguments just drive me crazy because they don't make any sense. But there's no such thing as an apolitical big business, right? I mean, I think that's one of the things that people keep saying about this Georgia law, right? All of these companies, Delta, Coca-Cola, United, whatever, they all have lobbyists. They all donate to politicians on both sides of the aisle. Republicans are sort of fine when they're using their weight to push for lower taxes or whatever. They're perfectly happy with Citizens United, the Supreme Court law that ruled that these corporations can spend unlimited amount of money on political causes, whatever they are. So I just don't really buy the backlash. I mean, these laws are intended to make voting harder, whatever. I think that's the baseline. And yes, in Georgia, they're expanding early voting in some rural counties, which some people would argue, well, they're actually making it easier to vote. That's a little bit of a MacGuffin there. Like, the purpose of these laws is to make it harder and more confusing to vote. Every American should have a problem with that. I mean, we should be doing the opposite, I think. And as for these companies, I mean, look, they're damned if they do, damned if they don't, right?
Well, this is the problem with companies trying to get involved with social issues. Nike was one of the first that really took a stand, and Colin Kaepernick is one of their biggest spokespeople. It's tough, but consumers are now expecting that from companies, especially now with social media. Like, it's much easier to call out a company for their political or their social stance. By the way, two things that I wanted to talk about. Even the Democrats in Georgia are actually unhappy about the decision to move the All-Star game. Because when you think about who that decision is actually hurting, it's the people who work in the stadium, the local restaurants and the hotels. One other, it wasn't really a contrarian take, but just putting this into perspective, there was an article in the New York Times this weekend from Nate Cohn, who covers elections and voting issues. So he says, look, regardless of the intention of the law, and Carlo, you're in terms of like the reason behind it to suppress Democratic votes and suppress minority votes, his argument, though, is that he says the law's voting provisions are actually unlikely to significantly affect turnout or Democratic chances, and it could even plausibly increase turnout. In the final account, he says it will probably be hard to say whether it had any effect on turnout at all. And I pulled a few of the paragraphs that I thought were interesting. He said, for decades, reformers have assumed that the way to increase turnout is to make it easier to vote. Yet surprisingly, expanding voting options to make it more convenient hasn't seemed to have a huge effect on turnout or electoral outcomes. That's the finding of decades of political science research on advance, early, and absentee voting. Another reason that convenience voting, he says, may not be as convenient for lower turnout voters who essentially decide overall turnout. So he says for low turnout voters, okay, they probably aren't thinking about how they're going to vote a month ahead of the election when they're going to need to apply for an absentee ballot, which is where this law really has an impact. So he said someone who's thinking about that is probably a high turnout voter. Low turnout voters might not even know until election day whom they're going to support, and that makes them less likely to take advantage of advanced voting options like no excuse early voting, which requires them to think about the election early and often, to submit an application, fill out a ballot, and return it. Again, just an interesting.
That was a very good piece.
It was just a kind of like, let's put this into perspective in terms of the actual implications on the ground. And he's saying, look, the Democrats are going to probably be so incensed about this, which they are, that it might actually increase turnout. It could backfire on the Republicans, is what his argument.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we'll see.
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen calling for a minimum global corporate tax rate as a way to make it harder for U.S. companies to relocate offshore. The Biden administration wants to raise the corporate tax rate from 21 to 28% to fund some of its $2 trillion infrastructure bill. The Trump administration had lowered it to 21% from 35%, arguing that low taxes incentivize companies to stay in the U.S. Yellen said a minimum global tax rate would stop a, quote, race to the bottom of countries outdoing each other to attract businesses.
I don't know how that would ever work, because how would it ever be enforced? I guess
it won't.
Right?
I feel like this was
never.
the biggest non-story ever because she has no power over any other country.
Yeah, that was sort of my take.
Thanks, but no thanks. I mean, it's an interesting idea, but
yeah, right. That was sort of my takeaway too.
I mean, not no one cares, but no, you think Ireland's going to turn around and say, you know what? Let's raise taxes. Let's do it.
Yeah. But separately, Democrats who are in charge of writing tax law now that they control both houses of Congress, they just released their new plan that's going to overhaul how multinational corporations are taxed, offering some incentives to keep businesses in the U.S. to this point, while also raising taxes to help pay for this infrastructure bill. President Biden came out yesterday. He said, quote, there's no evidence that raising taxes drives companies out of the country. And this, I thought, was very interesting. Last night, Joe Manchin, the most powerful man in America, really, the senator from West Virginia, he just came out and said that 28% for the corporate tax rate is too high. It should be 25%, which seems a little bit curious because Manchin himself endorsed Obama's plan to drop it from 25%, from 35% to 28% back in 2012. So it feels like he's just kind of trying to split the difference to appear as the centrist that he is. But his voice matters more than any other voice when it comes to legislation in this country. So whatever he says matters.
I'm laughing because it's like the Biden team kind of did split the difference because it was 35. Right. Trump cut it to 21, so they were like, all right, let's do 28. And it's like his Manchin, he just wants so much to play that middle ground negotiator.
Yeah, exactly. Let's say 25. All right, what's the median between 21 and 28?
I will be the deal maker regardless of what happens. Switching gears. Week 2 of the Derek Chauvin trial opened with testimony from the Minneapolis police chief, who said Chauvin absolutely violated department policy when it comes to the use of force, rendering medical assistance, and de-escalation, and that Chauvin defied his own training while restraining George Floyd. No way around it. That is pretty devastating
Yeah.
testimony for the defense, given that its main argument has been that Chauvin was basically going by the book in his encounter with Floyd.
Yeah, that was my takeaway. I mean, that was brutal testimony from Chief Aaron Dodo from Minneapolis. Probably the most compelling testimony yet for the prosecution, because just think about it. It is really rare for a police chief to take the stand against a fellow officer. It's rare for any law enforcement official to take the stand against another cop. You just don't see that when police are on trial. And remember, Derek Chauvin's own police union called for him to be fired immediately after this happened last year. So there's not exactly like a rush in law enforcement to circle the wagons for this guy. Nobody really wants to defend him. I'm starting to think that, I mean, I don't know, crazier things have happened, but it's hard to see how he's going to walk from this trial. I mean, again, famous last words, right?
Yeah, at least up until now, this seems like an open and shut case. It actually is worse for him than you would have even imagined, just in terms of the testimony and what's come out. But as you say, it's hard to convict police officers just historically.
Right.
So of course, we've got to wait until the end of the trial, and we'll see what the jury decides. Let's talk a little tech. Apple CEO Tim Cook escalating his war of words with Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg, telling the New York Times in a rare podcast interview that Facebook's stance on privacy is flimsy. Facebook told investors it's a coming change to Apple's iOS privacy policy is going to hurt its ability to target users with ads, although Cook said that he doesn't buy it. And I don't know why Facebook keeps putting this argument out there, like any regular person cares about this, right? I mean, like Facebook users are not sympathetic to Facebook saying, we're not going to be able to target you with exact ads. I don't know. In the PR world, Zuckerberg just is not, he just doesn't have
he's on the losing end. Yeah. I mean, the Facebook argument here is that small businesses, which make up the most of the people the companies that advertise on Facebook, it's going to be harder for them. So it's going to be harder for your local plumber to target you with an ad on Facebook. I don't know, whatever, right? But Tim, this was an interesting interview with Tim Cook, if you had a chance to listen to it. He also basically hinted that Apple is making a car. That rumor has never been confirmed. This is pretty much the closest thing we've gotten to a confirmation that they're working on an actual car. So that'll be interesting. I mean, pretty wild to think, right? An Apple car, I guess that would be cool. He also came out against the Georgia voting law, which isn't really surprising because Tim Cook has been very focused on civil rights. He said that he probably won't be at Apple in 10 years. But it is interesting to see just how much he makes a point of talking about how little he thinks of Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg pretty much in any interview he does these days. He called privacy the issue of the 21st century. And look, say what you will about the Apple cartel, right? But they are committed to user privacy in a way that really none of those other tech giants are.
They are.
I mean, they're
They are, and I don't want to take that away from them, but their business model doesn't depend on user data. Their business model is based primarily on hardware. They sell phones, So, and they are ripping off consumers in different ways, like
that's for
changing
sure,
the jack on your so they're still a major company, and it's just a lot and I'm not defending Facebook, it's just like a lot easier to say privacy is going to be our thing when that's actually good for your business. That makes good business sense for you. The Apple car is super interesting. If there's one, that's like a Tesla competitor. If there's any competitor to Tesla, it would be an Apple car, I think.
Yeah, I mean, they have the branding. It would be, it wouldn't be like a mid-range thing. It would be like a luxury car. It probably costs like $150K. It would probably look really cool.
And that's their thing, right? They're never usually the first to come up with something. They just are. They just do it better. Right. Mm-hmm. Okay, March Madness is over, and we have a national champion. Baylor dominated Gonzaga 86-70 to win the NCAA Men's National Championship in Indianapolis. The Bears put on a defensive clinic from the start, ending the Bulldogs' hopes of completing the first undefeated season in 45 years. Baylor becomes only the second team from Texas to win a national title.
fourth basketball title for the school, but the first for the men's team. The women have won 3 times, including a couple of years ago, I believe. They're kind of sad. I didn't get a chance to watch the game again because the tip-off was at 9:30 p.m. Eastern last night. What is this? Put it on the platform. Put it on the presidential platform, Jill. But yeah, I was a little bit sad. I was hoping the Zags could do it, but I think they must have just been so exhausted from that Saturday OT game. I mean, that must have been just so mentally draining. So I was rooting for them. I'm a little bit bummed. But Baylor, an amazing team.
I spoke to my dad, who's a basketball coach, and I said, "So give me your post-game analysis on what went wrong for Gonzaga." And he said it was the Saturday game that was just they were physically exhausted. They were emotionally exhausted. It's that shot at the buzzer was all anybody wanted to talk about. It was kind of like that was their championship game in a way. And he said from the start of the game, Baylor just had it, right? They came out, I think he said Baylor scored the 9, it was 9-0 at the start.
They were up the whole game, yeah. It wasn't even a competition.
All right, and finally, Carlo, tell us about Jody Waters, who was one of the 10 people who were killed in that Colorado supermarket shooting.
Yeah, she was the 10th of our victims, the last one. She was a native of Illinois, known for her sense of style and her friendly, outgoing demeanor. She worked at a local Boulder boutique, and her family said she had dreams of one day opening her own store. She was really in with the fashion community out there. Also a mother of 2. And a new grandmother, and she died in that supermarket at the age of 65, Miss Jody Waters. So that's all we know about her, and that concludes our remembrance, Jill, of these 10 people. These just 10 regular Americans. I think that's sort of my takeaway from doing this research these last week and a half. These were just regular people, right? Just regular old folks going about their day at that grocery store before their lives cut short by a madman armed with a Ruger AR-556 pistol that he legally purchased a week earlier.
Carlo, thank you for doing this and keeping this just top of mind for us. And incredibly sad.
I think it's important.
I think we should also make sure that we pay attention to what's going on with gun laws and this. Is there ever any traction? What's happening? I just think we should keep an eye on it as well.
Of course.
Okay. That is what you need to know for Tuesday, April 6th.
All right, guys. See you mañana.